Going to H to see if it's streaming. So today I'm trying to convert a library to the imperative approach, and it has been a long time since I haven't streamed, so I decided to stream today. Probably not gonna stay for long, I think. But I found this very cool library. They do pretty much exactly what I was trying to do. But I'm trying to convert to the imperative approach because I'm not really sure which way to go about it, but I think that is like they both have positives and negatives, and going through this process of trying to convert, I'm understanding more and more like the trade-offs between them. So in the declarative approach, it suits the React way a lot better. And I also understand now why some people don't like React, is because it feels like everything you have to put inside of a hook. And it's something that I thought about before, but I didn't realize that I was like I couldn't put into words what the feeling that I had when trying to do stuff with React. But I always understood that it's harder to do it with React. And the reason why is because you have to think about the re-rendering of components and the whole life cycle of the website. So this is the annoying part of dealing with React, is that everything you're gonna do, you have to think about how the components are gonna re-render and which hooks to use and things like that. And I think that obviously the reason why you have to do it, to think like that, is because React is gonna handle the state of the website. So like I haven't made my mind on when it comes to that, to the frameworks, because I don't have a lot of knowledge on the other ones. But that's the downside of doing things with React, that it gets very complicated, and it feels like it's a lot more complicated than it should be. So that's the reason why I want to move more to the imperative approach, because, and also the other positive side of the imperative approach is that it decouples the core essence of the application from React, in case in the future I want to try something else. So like, and this is the main reason I think why I want to do it with the imperative way. It's both more flexible, allows you to have more control, and also decouples from React. So I can like be closer to the core of the website. But the downside of moving to the imperative is that it feels like I'm doing stuff the wrong way, because it doesn't fit together with React really well. So, and the biggest reason I think is because of the hooks, because the way that I'm trying to do is put everything inside of this function here, like initialize the visualization in this function. So the 3JS parts, and then maybe later on I'm gonna do the physics outside. And the downside is that I can't put hooks inside of here. So I have to initialize things here and then change the functionality on the main component, and it feels kind of weird. I couldn't figure out a way that is good. Mainly this thing here that I stopped, but there are other configurations as well. But this pretty much determines the type of action that is going to happen when the user click and drags. So the other library, I found a bunch of other useful libraries that the other one uses, which is this one. So this library uses other libraries that are very useful. One of them is camera controls, and it seems like the camera controls is a lot better than the standard 3JS controls. And I pretty much just found this library and I tested I went through their docs, and I found that the visualizations they have are very good, and it's pretty much exactly what I want to do. And then by studying that library and React Refiber, I found other useful libraries. So I'm trying to just use the libraries that they use and then try to move everything to the imperative approach. But if I can't do this until Friday, I'm probably just gonna use their library. because I feel like I spent too much time on this already, and I have to study compilers, interpreters, and stuff like that. But that's pretty much their library, and it looks really good. Also download this locally, and also spend a bunch of time studying React with Fiber to understand how they, which is another thing that I'm thinking about whether or not I'm going to try to do. But React with Fiber uses another library called ExpoGL, which creates a component that allows you to initialize a WebGL canvas, and it seems like it's more optimal to use that, but then it's more work as well. And then from this library I got the classes that they use. They use React with Fiber, React Ray, and React Spring. So this is the challenge, is because the way that they do the animations, the other library that they use is Graphology, which is a library that I saw a long time ago, and I realized that at the time I didn't want to do it with their library, but now I realize that it's much better because they already have all the graph algorithms with the layouts and stuff like that, and I think that's one of the things that I want to copy from this one. So just use Graphology, but then the challenge is that they use the React Spring to animate, which is a library that allows you to handle positions. So in all of the components, the node components, the labels, and the nodes and the edges mainly, they use the React Spring library. See if I can find. And then they use this A, which is animated group. So it's this library here, and this library handles the animation. But then I look at the source codes from them, and it's not very clear. But it looks like you can use the use spring hook, and then from the use spring, you determine the positions. So I still haven't figured out how. I didn't get to the part where I'm gonna try to implement the layout. But it's very confusing because everything is connected, so to move to the imperative is kind of hard. And so I made this list here, and I'm trying to follow this. The other part that is annoying about React is this part of setting the, because for testing and stuff like that, to build the simple. So my plan is to build this component, and then once I get to the point that it runs the visualization, then I'm just gonna like copy the component and put it on the application that I have. So for now, what I'm doing is setting the nodes and the edges here. Later on, I'm gonna pass as props, but if I set inside of the component, it's kind of annoying because then, like, there is if I put them inside this use layout effect, which was working on another project that I was building to test things and to learn, here is not working for some reason, and I think it's because of the React cycle. Because this runs, then you have to set the effects, but then I think that this runs before the nodes are set, so I can't really run these functions here. So it gets annoying, and then initializing them outside here also doesn't seem like a very good thing to do. But at least now it's working, so it's initializing the graph. And then the other thing that I was thinking about as well that I wasn't sure is whether or not to initialize the classes inside of the use effect or initialize them on here. And ChatGPT recommends using useRef to initialize the placeholder for a class. And also found another example instead of Stack Overflow that uses useState to initialize here outside, because you want to create an instance of the class every time the component mounts and unmounts. So you have to use useState if you're gonna initialize here, otherwise it just creates one instance when it renders, and then it doesn't update when mounts and unmounts. But then the question is which approach is better, you know, which one makes more sense, and I couldn't find like a very clear answer. So those are the parts that I'm struggling the most thinking about, because it's not so much about what you do, it's more about trying to figure out what is the best way to go about it, and it's really hard to make all of these decisions. And so I'm trying to follow this list here. And the last thing that I did was to add the geometries that I got from the other project. But I'm not sure now. I have this is the problem, because I have to, the way they are doing here is using the components, and the components calculate the position in a different way. So I have to think about how I'm thinking about now that I'm gonna initialize from the class. I just put the positions here on these files. That these are the functions that I'm gonna run. So I'm gonna loop over the nodes and edges here. And then I'm going to call these functions to initialize the visualization. So this is another thing that is different from the way that I was doing before, because before I could put the elements of the visualization inside of the node object. But if I use graphology, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do that. So this is another thing. I think this is one of the reasons why I didn't use graphology in the beginning. But yeah, that's what I have to figure out. So the way that I'm doing now is putting the positions here. I initialize like a random position for each one. I initialize a random position, then I just pass as an argument. The problem is I need to access this position, and I'm gonna need to access the graph object later for initializing the edges, which I'm doing here. So I'm not really sure what is the best way to do that, and if I can put on the graphology objects, I can just add to the object. So I think this is the main difference, because the way that they do, the way that they are doing is using the React Spring, and the React Spring keeps track of the positions, I think. And because they are using React Tree Fiber as well, they create components, and then you pass the positions inside the components, I think. And then they have all these flag variables here to set the logic of what is going to happen based on the customization. So the way that it works is they pretty much allow you to pass a bunch of props to the main component, and then based on those props is gonna determine what's gonna happen on the other children component. And then they have set up a default props, so they're using the canvas from React Tree Fiber, and then they create these custom components by using React Tree Fiber and React Tree Dray. And the other difficult part is that there are some components that are called billboard. This one that comes from React Tree Dray. I'm not 100% sure how they work, but I think that they have something to do with setting the positions of everything. And also the animation is kind of hard to think about, because they set things up with React Tree Spring, but if I'm gonna use it from the 3JS classes directly, then I'm not really sure if I have to create other functions to update the positions, because obviously I'm not gonna be using the library, and from what I saw from the code, I couldn't figure out. I didn't spend enough time to figure out how it works in React Tree Spring. It's kind of annoying, the code. So I think the first thing that I have to do here, I think following these steps is, because in the beginning it's very confusing, so that's the reason why I created these steps. So I think I'm just gonna try to follow one by one, and then get closer and closer to the implementation there. And then I see, I think about it. And also for the drag and highlights, they use another library that is from the same people that created React Tree Fiber, which is use gesture. And then they put another hook, like the wrap, they use gesture with another hook that they created. And they use that to move the nodes, but I can't do it like that, because it's more tailored to the declarative way, let's say. So in the imperative way, which is pretty much the same thing, obviously, because it's just more about the declarative is just a way to do it with React, the way that I think about it. And the imperative is like if you deconstruct everything and you just get to the bottom from the fundamental layer. So the way you do it with the imperative way is to use a raycaster, which is something that allows you to see the movement of the light, let's say, on the projection. So it's like you're projecting a light into the scene, and then based on the projection, you find the movement, you find the positions of the objects, as far as I understand. And then based on that, you see whether or not the object is being hovered or selected, and then you use that. So later on, I think I'm gonna figure that out. But first, and it looks like that from... Also, I didn't understand very well, but I think that the camera controls by default already have all the functions, so you don't need to do anything like that. Anything like very extra, let's say, from on top of the library. But they use this hook here, which is using imperative handle, and I didn't understand how it works really well. But I think that it allows you to access the functions declared here on a child component from the parent component. But it's still not very clear for me what exactly are all of the events. They are also using another library called hold event, which allows you to set up the key events, which I think I'm gonna only do like once I have everything else figured out. But this is the part that is confusing, because here they declare these functions here, but it looks like these functions are not they are not related to the mouse events. They are just set up here for the keyboard events. So I think for the mouse events, all I have to do is just set up the camera controls, and then it works by default, I think. The main annoying problem I was having using the orbit control from 3GS on the other project is that the movement of the panning on the canvas is not very good, because it's more like a 3D panning where it's rotating the visualization instead of moving around. And it looks from this here that it has the exact effect that I want, which is just panning like this. And then they have another example that you can rotate, and this is selected based on the props you pass. So this is the style more that Orbit Controls has, I think, where it just rotates the visualization. But on the project that I have was kind of weird as well, and I didn't like it very much. I prefer the other one a lot more, where it's just spinning. So I think now I'm gonna map over the nodes here, probably. I read the graphology documentation, but I'm not really sure. Like what exactly does the nodes, like how what are all the methods? I didn't spend a bunch of time looking at the layout functions, which is another thing that I have here. They have a bunch of from graphology, and this is the part that I'm interested on as well, because it allows you. The layout functions are pretty much algorithms that are gonna set up the visualization in a way that is usually easy to visualize what's going on. So I think that's very nice. I think the main difference of the stuff that I'm trying to do and the way that they are doing is that they are using React 3 Spring, and I'm going to use a physics engine, I think, which is gonna be Rapier. And I'm thinking about using a hook from React 3 Fiber, React 3 Rapier, which is use assets, which comes from another library called It's Fine. It also comes from the same group that created React 3 Fiber, that allows you to initialize Rapier just with the hook. I think that's a lot better, because it's kind of annoying to call the function async inside of the use effect, even though it worked on the other project. Still one of those things that is kind of annoying because of the way that React works. And this is the stuff that I mean that I'm spending the most time, which is because it's really hard to decide like what is the best approach. Because my concern is that later on, like if I encounter any problems, like how easy it's gonna be to fix everything and how fragile the setup is. And it feels like it is more robust if I use the libraries, but there's a bunch of code that is not necessary, and it is very confusing. So, yeah. And this is what I mean here, is that the camera controls allow you to set up two functions, I think, for the panning, which are these two functions here. But in this case, they set up here, and the only thing that they do is just set panning to true or false. But it doesn't seem like this variable here that they're setting is used anywhere. I couldn't find anywhere that is used, so I don't understand really well why they are doing this. So the way that they do it is they set up a Zustan store, which Zustan is a library for controlling the context, for managing context in React. And also comes from the same group that created the reactor fiber. And also they use Zustan on reactor fiber as well. So I think it makes sense for them to use Zustan. I'm probably gonna use Zustan at some point as well. And the way that they do is they created the store in the beginning, and they set up everything that they're gonna use on the store. And then on all the components, they just use the values. So here, for example, no, this is from usetree, but I think it's the same thing. It's just another store. And here, the set panning is just using the store that they create and setting the value of the panning. The state is the previous state from the store, and then you just call this function, pass the state here, and then just update. So it's very similar to the way that use state works in React, I think. But I still don't understand very well how Zustan works. I think I'm gonna learn more once I try to apply it. And the other part that is challenging as well is this use frame, because it sets up the request animation frame and then uses a tree clock class to keep track of the time, but I'm not really sure how to do this, like, because this is a problem. If I initialize everything inside of this function here, then if I initialize the request animation frame here, like how I'm gonna access on the component, and the thing is, like, I can think about ways to do it, but it's like a lot of different ways, and it's hard to think about what is the best way. This is the challenge. So it's not so much that like it's hard to do, it's more that which way is the best way to do it that is hard to think about. And this is from the camera controls, I think. They just call the update function from the camera controls. Yeah, camera ref. I bet should focus on one thing at a time. So I think what I'm gonna do now is try to first I'm gonna console log, I think, there. I need to create the functions, or create the graphics, and see if anything shows up there. Probably what I'm gonna do is just request animation frame here. Just call this function at the end. I think the other approach is just to return the function. Like I declare the function here, return it, and then I make it equal to a variable. Oh, actually this is a class, so I can make it equal to, or I can put a function inside of the class, like render function, and then put the request animation frame inside of that. I think that's a good idea. And then I just call the render outside here. Like here. So what I'm gonna do is just see if I can find the positions. I have to think about how I'm gonna structure everything here so I can call these functions, set the positions in the right way, and then start the visualization. I think that's the next step. I'll be right back. The problem with initializing this stuff here is that it might fuck up the visualization. Obviously this is not the best, but yeah, just doing like this so I can see if it's gonna work or not. I think that, yeah. On the application I'm just gonna put I'm gonna receive as props and then hopefully it's gonna update automatically. I can just put the thing as a dependency, I think, on the user fact that I initialize everything. But it is something that I'm not sure about, because ideally I think I would, and this is the main problem I was thinking about yesterday, I think, that ideally I would initialize all these classes inside of one user fact, and then put all of the customization on other user facts. Because then what is gonna happen is that when the customizations change, instead of reinitializing the graph and everything, it's just gonna change whatever props changed from the customization, from the classes. But if I put the customizations inside of the same user fact, then every time that props change, it's gonna reinitialize the entire graph, which I think is not very good. And this is the stuff that I'm not, I don't know, like what is the best way to solve it, because if I initialize this inside of another user fact, then the other user facts don't have access because it's outside of their scope. So it's very confusing to think about. I think the way that they do it is just based on the props. But I don't get how it's possible that, because there are a lot of examples here where they allow you to change the graph. And it seems like the graph doesn't restart, let's say, when you remove. So this is my biggest concern. It's like, how can I make it with the imperative approach so it is the same way, but maybe if I do it the way that I'm doing, it's gonna work. Because obviously if I add a node and then it reloads the graph every time, it's gonna be really bad. So but I think if it doesn't work, then I'm just gonna use the library instead. It's a lot easier. Which is also something that I've been thinking about. It's probably I should. I think in this project that I'm doing now, it makes sense for me to like try to do everything from scratch, because I don't have. I didn't know anything about graphics programming before this project, so I'm learning a lot by trying to do all this stuff. So I think it makes sense. But maybe if I already knew, it's probably just a lot better to just use the libraries instead. Because then, like, if I was just using the libraries, I could be studying compilers for about a week now, I think, or even more. Because I already had things solved with the vector fiber in the very beginning, so. Let me think. So I don't know. As the ID and labels. I think I have to look at the graphology documentation. The way that I'm thinking about doing is... I think I opened this project just to copy some stuff. So the way that I'm thinking about doing is initializing everything here. So I loop over the nodes here and the edges. Then as I loop through the nodes, I call the create nodes function from this thing here. And then this function is gonna call the other ones that contain the 3JS stuff that is gonna create the material. And so the way that it works on 3JS is you have the material and you have the geometry, and then you have the main mesh. So the material is the specifications of how the thing is gonna look like, and the geometry is the shape. So I just copied the stuff from the other library, and I simplified some stuff, and this is the part that I'm gonna change in the future, because when you allow customization, it's probably gonna be better to just put everything to a variable here and then pass the variables around. And I'm probably gonna use a Zustand store to keep track of all the variables, because that's how they do it on the other library as well, and I also think that it makes sense. But it does add some complexity, so it's kind of annoying. And then you create the mesh from the geometry and the material. So I think I call this, and this is gonna create the thing. So, but I need to figure out, I need to create a link between this object here, the mesh, and the nodes from the graph. So I think here what I'm gonna do is just make a property on the node for the label and the position. Maybe I'll call sphere. The node already has a label, I think. Yeah, label. This is like something I'm not really sure about though, because I have to understand more how they do it on the other one, because I know that they use a bunch of layouts, like they use the layouts algorithms from the graphology, but I don't understand really well how it works with React. It's tough because everything is different, because they are using the other libraries, so like everything is a component here, and the positions are different, so I have to understand how they do it here, so I can do the same thing on the other one. I need to know like what exactly is necessary. It's kind of annoying as well, because they have a bunch of variables and they're passing the variables as props. So you have to trace down or trace up to whatever they initialize the variables, and some of them depend on examples, which is kind of annoying as well. But the good thing about this one is that you can run here if you download locally, and these files are the ones that are these ones from the documentation, so I can change them. I can run them locally and change them to understand how it works. I'm gonna try to search for a method that doesn't just give the IDs. And I think on the initialization, I'm just gonna get the node IDs. That's another thing that they do as well. But this is the thing, is that they use memo to memorize, to cache the node IDs, the values. So I'm not really sure how to go about this, because like you can map here, you can get the graph nodes a map and then make a variable inside of the class, but then it's not going to be cached, so it's just going to run every time that the component mounts and amounts, which is not good. So I guess it would be better, but then again I can memorize here because I'm initializing here, and then it goes back to the stuff that I was saying before, where I'm not really sure where is the best place to initialize this. Like maybe I should initialize the graph outside. I think that might be a better thing to do. And then I just clean the nodes when the component amounts here. I think that's how they are doing on the other one. Let me see. Yeah, they use a hook, a custom hook called useGraph, I think, on the graph scene here. So this is a component inside of this one. This is the main component from the library. So inside of this one, they call this graph scene here. And I think it's inside of this one that, yeah, they use this hook here, useGraph, and then they pass a bunch of specifications for the graph. And then they use the substance star to initialize here, but I remember that I think maybe it's on the star that I think it's on the star that they initialize. That's the difference. So they're initializing the graph on the star. And then these are the functions that are gonna change the layout, I think. That comes from this component and is inside of a bunch of use effects. I think this is the hardest part because it makes a lot of sense the way that they're doing things, because it goes like very well with React because of the way that the state's gonna be managed. So they put everything inside of a user state variables, and then they combine that with the substance star. So like the substance star is like the main central thing, let's say. And then from that you have a bunch of different components. Maybe. And it makes a lot of sense, but then the problem is if you're going to do it with the imperative way, how do you mimic that? Because the problem is, like, I can't use the use state inside of the functions, and declaring the use state outside, like, it's kind of difficult to think about a good way to merge the two. So like the way that it works is that you have the use stand here, the zoo stand star. As far as I understand now. Which is the central thing, and then from this zoo stand you have a bunch of different components. And then on each of these components you're gonna have the use state variables. And because the use state variables are set inside of use effects, every time that value changes, it's gonna rerun, like it's gonna re-render the component, and then it's gonna do diffing, which is just comparing what props changed, and then it's gonna change just whatever was changed, which makes a lot of sense. So the question is how do I move, like how do I achieve the same thing without coupling everything to React and doing the imperative way? That's the challenge. So I think that maybe I should put, for now, the graph outside. Should initialize the graph here. The problem is that maybe I should initialize the graph outside, and then I just put this function inside of another use effect. I think that's a good idea. So every time that there is a change on the nodes and edges, it just runs the use effect for the build graph. But then, yeah, I think that, yeah, this is probably the best way, because then the other one is, since I'm initializing the graph outside, the other one is gonna have the access to the graph. I think this is probably better. And then obviously later I can when I create the Zustan store, I put the graph. I don't want to create the store now. I'm probably just gonna copy the store that they use on the other library and then modify it to however I'm gonna do things here. But I want to gradually implement, like try to translate, because it's too many things to think about. So I want to keep it as simple as possible and then gradually move everything for the other approach. So hopefully if I do like this, it works. And I have to see... I have to figure out how to loop over the nodes on the graphology and get the object here, because I want to modify the object as I loop over it inside of these functions here, so I can add this stuff. And the reason why is because I need the link, I think. So I think it makes more sense to loop over the nodes and edges and create the objects that are going to be used in the visualization first. And also here I have to append them to the scene as well. There's another thing. Oh, this is another annoying thing though, because I have to add the edges to the scene first, because otherwise the edges go on top of the node and it doesn't look very good. So in order for the edges to be invisible, like for the node to be on top of the edges, you need to add the edges first, which is annoying because I don't have the position of the nodes. To create the edges, I need the position of the nodes. So I need to create the nodes first, but then I need to add them later. So I think what I'm gonna do is just add them outside, but then it's kind of annoying because I have to do an extra loop. It's not very good. Yeah, but that's how I was doing, I think, on the other one. So I just store them here. Maybe I don't pass the scene, and then I just loop over them again later and just add after I created the edges. I think what I have to do first is just do the nodes, and then I think about the edges. I think the other reason why I want to do it like this is because I think later on it's gonna allow me to try to customize things and like improve the efficiency later on, I think, and that's very important. Because the downside of the other library, and as far as I understand now, like the trade-off is that if you use Reactor Fiber and other libraries, it becomes easier to develop, but then it becomes harder to optimize. But maybe I'm wrong, because the libraries also, like, they allow you to optimize in relationship to React, but not in relationship to the visualization itself, I think. So that's the thing. And the imperative approach, you have more control over the visualization if you want to customize later. But it's harder to make it work with React, I think. That's the trade-off. So I think I'm just gonna look at the documentation and try to see if I find the method for getting the objects, the node objects themselves. The idea is to loop over them, then I call this function. Also need to think about how, like, what... I think the color I'm just gonna do white for now, because the canvas that I have is black. And then later on I'm gonna pass as a props from the component. So I think I'm thinking about passing as options, which is an object, just so I don't have to pass a bunch of arguments. And then I was passing directly as options here, but to make it easier, I'm just putting the... Because from the example, they do it like this, where they... And this is an object on React, so when React is gonna initialize all the components and go over the tree, it extends the props with this. So both the props and default props are objects inside of each component that React has. So by doing things like by doing this, it allows you to put the default values for the props. But then the thing is that if you do like this, you can pass as an object, as a like just the name of options here. And the other thing that I think I'm gonna remove is the themes. And the way that they do it is by creating an object called themes, and then this object allows you to customize the nodes and edges. But obviously the way that I'm gonna do it is different, because I wanna like couple the customization of, I wanna connect the customization of the graph with the information flow from the code. So the customization is going to be around the logic from the code, so it has to be more flexible. So it's not going to be an object, it's going to be like a dynamic data structure, I think, that's going to change. So just going to create a bunch of variables, and based on those variables, based on whatever's happening on the code, create another component that is going to allow you to change the values, and it's probably going to be based on a Zustan store, I think. So I'm gonna create a store, then I put the store here, and I pass those values inside of the options here. And then from the logic, the store is gonna be like the controller between the visualization and the information flow from the, yeah. And the model is the parsing of the code. So I'm pretty much creating a funnel. Also, I thought about doing this, so to make it more clear on what I'm trying to do. So I have the codes. I think it's just 3. No. Yeah, customization. And then from here, the visualization. And then I use the visualization to improve the loop. So pretty much trying to create a feedback loop system based on this. And the challenge, I think, is not the visualization. The challenge is how do you... So I think that the central part of this and the overall bigger picture, because the challenge is not how to visualize, the challenge is how to visualize in a meaningful way. Because the biggest problem with this loop here is that the visualizations are going to be massive because the code is very complex, so it becomes really hard to understand what's going on. So the question is, how do you structure things in a way that allows you to extract meaning out of the visualization? And I think that this process here is the process of figuring out the multifactorial structure of code in relationship to space-time. So the way that I think about it is more like trying to figure out the link between the code, the geometrical structure of code with physics. And through this cycle here of feedback, I'm going to be able to clarify that for me. And then based on that, based on this, I think I can create a blockchain. So it allows, it connects both sides at the same time. So which is pretty much a blockchain. So this is the idea. And I think that the problem here with this is the intuition that I have is that doing with in the declarative way, it becomes harder to do this, because then, and this is the stuff that, but I don't have enough knowledge. That's the problem to know, because the issue is that this is, because I'm doing this, like, it would be a lot better if I didn't have to do the website, but then obviously, like, it decreases. If I didn't do the website, then there isn't a chance that I can get paid for this. So the only reason why I'm doing the website and all this stuff is just to get money through this cycle here, and then it allows me to fund the process of figuring out alignment with AGI by creating a blockchain. But the downside of that is that it makes it a lot harder, because then I have to care about the state. And the problem is that the state is going to be a multifactor spiral. Because the dome is a hierarchy, and inside of the dome, each event is a cycle. So, like, because I have to manage state, it fucks up the loop in a way, because I have to concern myself with this stuff with about React. And I think this is the reason why I'm trying to move more towards the imperative approach, because then it allows me to separate the cycle here from the React, because the React state is going to be noise. That's the problem. It fucks up this process here, because this becomes noise, because now I have to put a bunch of logic to deal with the state, or to optimize the visualization. So, like, for the user experience, which I don't care about, because obviously the main thing is this cycle here. And I think that this is another thing that I'm thinking about, is because, like, if the website doesn't work, I have to set things up in a way that allows me to pivot into something else by keeping this core structure here, because I think that this is the process that is gonna figure out AGI, and I think it has to be done on the blockchain to have higher chances of survival, I think. But I think this is the feedback loop system, because the way that people think about AGI right now is like everyone's trying to, not everyone, like there are some people that also think like this, but most people are thinking about creating bigger models or just focusing on the models, and I think that they don't realize that. And I'm very confident, I think that the actual true AGI is not going to be a model, it's going to be a network. That's the difference. It has to be a network, because a human being is also a network, and everything in nature is a network. So it's not going to be just one model, it's going to be a connection of models, and from that is going to AGI is going to be born. And I think that the main thing that matters is the structure of the network, not so much the models, because the structure determines what the models do. And it's exactly what happens with human beings as well, where, like, the systems we have, the market economy and the politics, determines what each individual human being does, and then based on the probabilities of the differences in genetics in human beings, then is going to determine the behavior and the overall culture of everything. So, and trying to figure out what every human being is going to do precisely is impossible. And also trying to figure out, for example, how all the transactions work in a market economy and everything that is happening is impossible. But what is possible is to define the rule set. So I think it's more about how you define the best rule set that's gonna allow you to maximize the probabilities that the emergent properties of the complexity of the network from the rule set is not gonna be a vicious cycle like the market economy is, because of the balance of the forces when it scales on space-time. So color. Let me see. Let me think. Yeah, so now I need to figure out a way to pass the node as an object and then add this properties to the node. I think I don't need to return anything if I do like this. And the position is gonna be kind of annoying as well, the nodes, the label position, because I don't want to be on top of the node. So I have to think about maybe just decrease or increase the y direction by a little bit, so that is either on top of or on the bottom. But the other part that is annoying is the rotation and how everything is gonna work with that. I think here it doesn't have the methods. So maybe looking at the source code is easier. This is another thing that I might do, which is now I think I'm using the version from the library, but I think it might be better, like once I have everything figured out, maybe it might be better to download everything locally and then refactor all the imports, so I have the code locally. But this is the thing that I don't know, is because it's very unclear to me, like this process here. It's very hard to find the line, because I also, at the same time, I don't want to, because I am wasting a lot of time by trying to do everything myself, just by having the libraries locally, I think. But then it allows me to have more control over this cycle here. But then the downside is that I become a lot slower, I think, because it's a lot harder to figure out everything. There's so much code here from these libraries. So, not really sure. Because the other thing I can do, obviously, like, is separate the cycle from what I'm doing. So just focus on trying to get people to use it and make money out of it as fast as possible. So just use all the libraries and do everything on a suboptimal way, and just try to focus on speed. And then if I can make that happen, then I can just set up a project on my own local computer. That's another approach. So and then obviously on the project that I set up, I don't need to care about all of this other stuff. The other thing is that the visualization is probably not it's helpful from like human being perspective, but it doesn't make any difference when it comes to the figuring out the consensus. I think it's more about the code and figuring out the fractal. But I think that the visualization does help a lot for me to understand and for a human being to understand what's going on. I think this is not gonna give me... Let me look at the source code here. Oh, let me see on the other projects as well, because... But I think that they pass everything as props. I think this is the main file that handles the logic for the graph. It sets up the graph from the start, but then it's gonna update with the nodes and edges at some point, I think. So let me look here. Yeah, what this component pretty much does is just sets up a bunch of effects for the graph. Just gonna determine how it's gonna be updated based on the state changes. So it's like setting a bunch of effects for the stores. It makes a lot of sense. I have to think about how I'm gonna do this in the imperative way. It's very hard to do. I think this is the function that is gonna initialize the graph for the layout. See if I can find... Because to create the components, they're looping over the nodes, I think. Maybe if instead of passing the graph, we just pass the nodes and edges. Yeah, that makes more sense. But then the issue is that they're two different objects. That's the problem. I think I have to use the graph. Because the graph is going to be the thing that allows me to create the layouts. So I need to connect the visualization. I can't just loop over the nodes and the edges, because then I'm going to be changing the object. Or maybe I can just loop over the nodes and edges and then call a method of the graph to get the node from the graph object. But I think it would be a lot better if I if I loop over the nodes and edges from the graph directly, because then I can modify their properties, and then I can access them later on to change the position and to connect with the physics engine. Which is another difficult thing to think about, like how to connect the physics engine with the graphology layouts. And how to make that work. And it's difficult because I don't understand how the React Spring works. They use Spring very well. There's another thing that I have to figure out.
you meet somebody and you feel like you're walking on a cloud. And every step you made all your life, wrong or right, led you to this place right here, right now. You know, it's like when you were at work and you said to yourself, you know, I'm gonna have a good time tonight. I'm gonna go out. So you put on your favorite shoes or you put on your favorite jeans. You get into the mood. You pull up to the club. It's a long line, but you don't care because you get up. Don't outside those doors. And you get that feeling all over again. And you get that chill up your spine because the DJ is playing your favorite songs back to back. And you're not in yet, but soon you know you're gonna be. Oh man, what's that feeling called again? What's that feeling called when finally you're in and you're standing in the middle of the floor and you open your arms real wide to accept those vibes, all those positive vibes, and your family's there, and all those people that are experiencing the same thing that you are experiencing at that moment in time.
I think I have to understand this before I do create the visualization, because it's gonna, like, one thing is dependent on the other, and this is the problem here. Like, the question that I need to clarify is how to connect the nodes, because here on this project they're just looping over the nodes and edges, and they are creating the components based on that. Because obviously they're gonna handle the positions and the animations in a different way. So I think I need to clarify more how does the layout logic change the positions based on the React Spring. So how does the animated group work? And here they're also using this. So this is another thing that I have to figure out, is how to translate this label rotation here. This is passed as an argument here, and this is gonna be, there's gonna be something equivalent on the 3JS form, but I don't know how to translate very well. Maybe I think I'm just gonna ask ChatGPT, see if I can figure out, see if ChatGPT helps me figure out. Yeah, I need to understand how this animated group works from React Spring more. And this class determines the rotation of the label. But I think I'll figure out this later. First thing that I have to figure out is how to clarify is how the layout is connected with the animated groups. My plan is to figure out how to loop over the graph, the objects themselves, and then add the graph objects to add the 3JS objects to the graph objects, so connect them. And then from the main class, I set up the functions for the layouts. So from the init visualization, in the visualization class. So I call these functions here that they set up the 3JS elements on the graph, and then I create other functions for the visualization class that are going to change the layouts. And they're going to do that based on the positions that I put of the 3JS classes instead of the nodes on the graph. So I need to connect them both. And I think that the way that they do it here is through they set up the components, so the classes handle the position, I think. and they use the use spring hook to change the positions, but I don't understand really well how it works. Maybe this one doesn't have a lot to do with the movements or the layouts. So I need to figure out how exactly. Maybe what I can do is just I'm gonna start this one and I'm gonna change the layout type here. I think this is the variable that selects which type of layout it's gonna be, and there are several different ones there. So I can change and see what happens. So let me search for this as well. So it's probably going to be on the rest, this thing here that is passed to the graph scene, and then it's passed here to the use graph, and this is going to initialize the graph and the layouts, which initializes a bunch of effects that are connected to the store. So whenever there's a value that changes, it's gonna re-render, mount and unmount the components again that depend on those variables. They are connected to the store through this use effects here. I think that's the logic. So the question is, how do I translate from this to the imperative way? I think that the best way is probably to set up the functions on the class, like I said. So first I initialize the nodes, find a way to link them with the visualization, the 3JS objects. So link the graph with 3JS objects. Then I set up the same functions inside of the class. And then from outside of the class, I set up the same hooks on the component and just call the functions instead. So pretty much do the same thing that they are doing here, but instead of setting up the functions here, I would set up on the class. And then I just put them inside of the use callback here, outside. So do the same thing and just change the place of the functions, probably. I think that's the way. You have to understand these functions. So maybe I'll break down this on smaller steps here. I think this is the way, probably. And then, let me think. A setup, name hooks. But this is the issue. That's the problem. It goes back to, I think what I'm gonna have to do is just initialize the class outside of the use effect, and then I'm gonna have to change, just see. The two main options I think is to initialize it as with use state or initialize it with the ref. And I think the difference between them is that the use ref, it maintains itself, I think, regardless of whether or not the component is mounted or maybe not, actually. I think there is a difference. The use ref is more immutable, I think. And the using state, it just is going to change the class each time that the components mounts and unmounts. Because I remember when I was going over the React source code that there is a difference between the ref and the state. I think that the state changes more often than the ref. The ref is more connected with the DOM, I think, and the state is more connected with the component. So it's more like it updates more often, I think. So this is the main difference. And the problem is that this changes the structure of the class, I think. So like I have to think about it, but maybe it doesn't matter that much, because what I can do is just create properties on the class that are gonna keep track of everything. I think this is the way, actually. So I neither use state or ref. I just initialize the class outside, which is gonna be this is like the singleton paradigm, I think. Singleton is when you create only one class and then you use it everywhere else. So you only create one instance. And I think if I initialize like that, it's gonna be like that. So if I just initialize the class outside here, the problem is that I need the render. That's the issue. I forgot about that. Maybe what I can do is just decouple the render from the class. That's another idea. I think this might be a better idea, actually. So instead of putting the render on the constructor, I think that's the way. Instead of putting the... So like I put this class outside. I think I'm gonna do that. It makes more sense now that I think about it. So like instead of thinking about this class as initializing everything on the beginning, I just set up every variable. Like I initialize outside, and then every variable that is gonna depend on the hook, I make it as a property of this, and I initialize as null. And then I let the React handle the state of the variables, and that's gonna... So the class itself doesn't initialize, it doesn't reinitialize every time. It just updates the values of the class according to the facts of React. I think that way it makes a lot more sense. So that allows me to emulate everything that the other project is doing, but then I use the class and the imperative approach instead. So I just set up the values here inside of this class, like the 3JS objects, and connect them with the graph. And the way I do that is through the use effects. I think that's the way, probably. Because this allows me to do the stuff that they're doing here, where they're using a bunch of use memo and use callback to optimize the state. So the only difference will be that instead of doing the function, I just call the methods from the class. And then I just put the variables from the class. So hopefully this works. Let me think about it. I think that the main difference will be that if I do it the way that I'm thinking now, it's gonna be different in this way, because the values for the graph and the visualization are not React components. They're just JavaScript objects, so it allows me to have more flexibility. So it's more connected with 3JS. So if I want to extract the core fundamental from React, from the website, it's gonna be a lot better to do it, because then I have like the core structure separated from React. I think that's the thing. That's the way, probably. I'll be right back. One problem that I have with this approach that I just talked about is that I'm not 100% sure like how it's gonna work when I put the component on multiple different parts of the application. So I'm gonna ask ChatGPT that. I think what is gonna happen is that it creates a new class, a new instance for every component, but then for the life cycle of that component, it's gonna have the same instance. Because this is initialized when the component renders, which is before it mounts and unmounts. And inside of the use effects, it runs the code every time that the component mounts and unmounts. That's the difference. So if you initialize inside of the use effect, it's gonna initialize a new class every time the component mounts. And then you have to, I think you don't need to destroy the class, but you need to remove event listeners if you have, or if you start event listeners inside of the class. But every time that the use effect runs, it just creates a new instance of the class. But if I do it this way, it only creates a new instance when the component is initialized. And then for the entire life cycle of the entire life of the component, it's only gonna have one instance of the class. And the only thing that I'm gonna be changing is the values of the attributes of the class based on the use effects. But then the question is whether or not when you have multiple components, if it is gonna create different instances of the class, or if it's just, I think it makes a lot more sense that it would create different instances. It has to be the case, but maybe not. So I have to think about a good way to ask ChatGPT, maybe search on DuckDuckGo as well. But I think if this way works, I think it's the best way probably. Maybe actually it doesn't matter that much, I think. Yeah. No, actually it does. Because I was gonna say that maybe what I can do is initialize this inside of a ZooStant class, in the same way the graph is gonna be initialized inside of the ZooStant. But I think that it's different because then ideally I would use the ZooStant store for the entire application. But I'm not sure if that's a good way to do it as well. I think that like this is probably the recommended way to do it. So the ZooStant works in the entire app. But maybe not actually, now that I think about it. I think they have an example with a bunch of them. Because this component obviously uses the ZooStant store. So isn't it going to initialize a new store every time you use the component? Or is just one store for the entire app? So that wouldn't make a lot of sense to me, because then the issue would be that as soon as you update a graph in somewhere else in the application, it's going to change the other graphs by default, which doesn't make sense. But at the same time, it makes more sense to me that the ZooStant store manages everything. So it's like use context in React, where if you use that context, then you're gonna change the value like in the entire application. Unless you initialize a new store or a new context each time you create a component, but that wouldn't make sense, I think. Because yeah, not really sure. This is on the basic menu. Yeah. Source code for this. It just creates a bunch of yeah, but that's the thing. Maybe I'll change the code here so that's yeah. I think this is the problem with this, is that because this component is coupled with the nodes and edges, then all of the visualizations are going to be connected with each other. And I think that this is a problem with the Zustand as well. If I have multiple different visualizations on the site, if you use only one star for them, as soon as you change one of the visualizations, it's going to change all the other ones. Because it's going to update the value of the star, which is going to re-render all the other components. Maybe, and I think it would be different if the variables were declared inside of the component, the way that I'm doing here. You're not using a star, because then every time you create a component, it's going to create a new class. So they're going to be separate from each other. But then the downside is that it becomes harder to manage the variables if you create multiple components. But I think that's fine, because since I'm doing on the imperative approach, I'm not going to have like a bunch of components connected. It's just going to, all the calculations are going to happen on the objects themselves, on the 3JS objects. So it's just going to be one component that handles everything. And then instead of having like the tree hierarchy, like Reactor Fiber does, I'm just going to have the algorithms inside of this class. But then the question is, would it be better, or would it be good to create a store to handle the other values? Yeah, but it looks like it doesn't change the values of the other ones. So they are separate. Maybe it's because it creates the component inside of this component. It creates the store inside of this component. So it creates a new store every time, maybe? Let's see if I can find the code that creates this, that is responsible for creating the store. I think it's probably that's how it works. It creates the store, creates a new store for each component, because initializing inside of the component, one of these components. Yeah, it initializes here. So initialize a new provider each time that you initialize a component, so it's multiple different stores. That makes sense. Oh, but it's kind of confusing. Because if you're using a normal context, maybe this is the normal no, it's just a context. So if you're using a normal context and you have multiple different providers on the same application, I think they would use the same context. And just because you're using a provider, it wouldn't create a new store. But maybe that's the difference between Zustand and the normal context. It's both the store that I want to clarify and the instance of the class. Which I'm pretty sure I understand for the class. The Zustan store I don't understand really well, but the class I think I'm correct. That it's gonna initialize a new instance of the class each time you call the component. And I think that this approach that I thought about now is probably the best. I separate the renderer from the class and I initialize as null when I initialize the class. And then inside of the use effects, I just change the variables for the class and I make them as dependents. Because then it's gonna create an infinite loop. But I can initialize inside of a use effect. And I don't need to put down the dependency, I think. And I can make the other use effects based on conditions of whether or not the class has the renderer or not. Not sure if that's the best approach. And then the visualization would be responsible for linking the graphology graph with the 3JS objects. And you would have the functions for the layouts. And then inside of this one, I put the use callbacks and use memo hooks to try to do the same thing that they are doing on this project. I think probably the context also does that when you create a new one. It's just that I'm used to setting the provider on top of the application. That's why, because I'm always using the same context. So I think I mixed up that on my mind. But I think probably the React context also works in the same way. Like every time, if you have a component that wraps the provider, every time you create a component, that component is going to create a new version of the context, even though you're using the same context. If that makes sense. So it's always the template of the store is always the same, but every time you initialize the graph component, it's gonna have a different instance of the template of the store. So the values are gonna change depending on which instance of the store it is, maybe. It's still kind of hard to. Yeah, I think it just works as a. Like the top level, it kind of determines like the scope of the state, let's say, of the context. The provider is the top level, and then it creates like a bubble. But the question is, what would happen if you have a component that has a provider that wraps another component that has another provider, and they are both from the same context? What happens on that situation? Because then, when you change the value of one, you would fuck up the other one. I think that probably doesn't happen, because there wouldn't be a point to that, maybe? Because you would just create another context, I think, another provider. If you wanted to do that, because then why not just put the provider on the outer scope? Maybe it does happen in some situation, but it's not common, I think. Yeah, that's answered the questions, I think. It just creates a different store for every time you create a component with the provider. So I think the next question is just going to be the one for the class. Once I clarify that, then I'm going to search for the function to get the node objects from the graphology graph and the edges. Then I loop over them, create the 3JS objects, and then I have to think more about how I'm gonna do that. Like one way is to like I can create a variable inside of the visualization and then connect, like initialize that variable to couple the 3JS objects with that class. The other way is to like, maybe I don't need the class as well. Because I'm gonna have the 3JS objects on the graph if I do it the way that I'm doing now. So there's no reason to have the visualization class, I think. I just access the... Well, the visualization class would be useful, I think, for managing the... It would be... Maybe I should change the name. Because then I can just put functions to manage the layouts of the graph and the rendering cycle through the request animation frame. Also the camera controls, so it's more like a controller for the graph, I think. Just manages everything that the graph does. So the question is, should I put the... I think I shouldn't initialize the 3JS objects on the class. I should just link them to the graph. So just create the value inside of the node here, and this is going to be inside of the graph, graphology graph. But then if I'm... Yeah, so what I should do is just create an instance of the graph on this class. And then the question is, how is this gonna work with React? Because I'm initializing the graph outside on the rendering. So does it make sense to create a variable here that is gonna be like this? So I have like an instance of the graph inside of this class, because this one is going to be based on changing the layout of the graph. But the question is, like, when would this ever be necessary? I think I kind of... I don't know how to put into words, but intuitively I think it makes more sense to do it like this, because like since the point of the class is managing the graph, like it makes more sense that the class itself has an instance of the graph. But then like the tricky part is that they can be like they have to be the same instance, I think, because it would be bad if for whatever reason this graph updates at some point, but then this one has an older version because I didn't update this. So yeah, I'm not sure if it makes sense or not to do it like this. The other option is just obviously to access this one, but I think I need to do it initialize like this, because if I do other methods, I'm not going to be able to... Yeah, I have to create an instance here, because I'm not going to be able to access this one from the other methods. So maybe... Yeah, I think that this makes more sense, actually. And then if I have a physics engine, I would put initialize the physics engine here as well. So this works more as a controller for the graph. It's like a bridge between the graph and the visualization that manages the flow. Depending on the customization. So I think the question is the context, because I'm going to create a component that has a context that's going to change, is going to customize the graph. And that component has to be connected with React, because it's going to, like, depending on what happens on the graph, on the customization, has to re-render the component, I think. So I'm going to put like a bunch of use effects here, I think, that are going to be based on the Zustan store that is going to contain the context. It's going to change the visualization. So I have to think about, like, what is the best way. I think what I should do is just make variables here. So I make a variable inside of this class equal to all of this. So I have an instance here, and then here I create the use effects based on the instance of the class. And then I set the state of the store based on this class. I think that's the way. Yeah, but let me think. I think the class has to be, like, it has to connect with the store, and the store is connected to the hooks. Because I need the custom component is not gonna have access to the class. So like the store is the bridge between the custom component that allows the customization and this class here. But the question is, like, how do I synchronize them? Every time that there's a change on the value of the store, or every time there's a change on the value on the custom components, I'm gonna set up a hook here that's gonna make the component re-render. No, it's not gonna make it re-render, it's gonna make it mount and unmount, but yeah, maybe that makes it re-render. That's another question. Because if it makes it re-render, then it's gonna create a new instance and fucks up. I think it doesn't do that because of the way that the other project is set up. Oh, but the other one, they initialize this on the store. Yeah, maybe it is better if I initialize this one on the store as well. And they just change the values. But then do I need this? I think that the reason why I decided to do this one is because of the render. Because on the other project they're using React Fiber, which is a canvas component, and the canvas component initializes a custom React reconciler. It's gonna use the Expo.gel to create the component that is gonna create the canvas, and then they set up everything. They set up the render and the other options when they initialize the canvas. I don't remember. And this is the thing, because then they also provide the hook, the use3 hook that is gonna have access, I think, to the instance of the renderer. And then the use frame is also gonna be based on the renderer. So let me think about it. I think it does make sense to create this class here. But I think it only makes sense if I do things in this class that on top of the layouts, because then I can just use the graph directly to set up the layouts, and then I do the same way that they did there, just put a bunch of hooks here. But maybe the biggest reason is for the render to have this class here. So initialize the render and make the use effect based on the render for this class on the other ones. I think. These are the decisions that are hard to make, because I'm not 100% sure about like these nuances. So the way that I was thinking about just now is just like this class is the controller, and then I have the star. The star is connected to the custom component. Then the custom component changes the values for the star. It's like here. Custom. And then the question is, so the hooks would have to be based on the star values, I think. So the question is, do I initialize this class here, or do I initialize inside of this star? I think it makes more sense to initialize inside of this star, and then I just change the values of the class based on the hooks, and I make the other hooks based on the condition of whether or not this class has a render or not. So I initialize the render as null, and then I check to see on the other use effects if the render is null, and I initialize this on the star. And the values are dependent. The dependencies of the use effects are going to be based on the values of the star, because then I think it has to be that way, because that's the only way for the custom component that is going to handle the customization for the graph to connect with this. It's not the only way, but it's probably the best way. Like the star is like a bridge between the two. It updates the values of the visualization based on the custom component. So it works like a bridge between the other components that are going to allow for the customization of the graph, and the class that controls the graph logic and maybe the physics engine and the render. I think that's the way, probably. So what I'm gonna do now first, because I don't want to deal with Zustan, I don't understand how it works really well, and it's gonna be annoying to set everything up. So I think what I'm gonna try to do is just this way that I'm doing now, but then I keep in mind that I'm gonna move these two classes to a star. And then what I'm gonna do here instead is the same thing that they do on the other project, where they initialize these values here based on the star on the other components, and the star contains the logic for how the use effects are gonna run, are gonna be updated. I think this is probably the best way. Yeah, so they use star here, and so instead of initializing the class, I'm just gonna use the hook, and I'm gonna access the value of the visualization class. I have to see if they use that. I'm pretty sure that they do somewhere to access the value of the graph. I think that they do on the nodes probably. I remember seeing it somewhere. Sure where. Yeah, here they're accessing the nodes, and I just... Yeah, here. So they set everything up inside of this, and then they access this instance. So, and here they are also gonna change the value on the star. So I think for the other class makes more sense to do it this way as well. And then inside of the hooks, I think that's the biggest difference, is that here they're changing the values of the components, and I'm gonna change the values of the class instead. So the question is whether this will work or not. So instead of using like a class here, for example, I'm gonna use, instead of using the layout current, which is the use ref, I'm gonna use the value of the class instead of the star, but I'm not really sure if this is a good idea. Nice stuff to the side. What you do? Is one side I'm thinking like maybe it's just better to copy everything, because it makes a lot of sense the way that they did everything here. Maybe I don't need the other class. And then the only main difference would be that instead of using the directory fiber canvas, I just do the code outside, use the normal React DOM render, and then I try to see if I can use the Expo gel as well. So the only difference would be that I set up the render in the imperative way, and then I just do everything else. Yeah, but the other difference is the elements. I think that's the biggest difference. So instead of using the components, I'm creating 3JS classes. That's another difference. But I think for the layout, maybe it doesn't make sense. It makes more sense to do it like this. And they change the value of the nodes and edges based on this. Which are the values from the star. So I think that the biggest difference, maybe I shouldn't do the visualization class to handle the layout. The layout, I just do it like this. And I leave the visualization class to just initialize the 3JS. So that's the only difference, I think. The biggest difference is that instead of using the Reactor Fiber components, I just use the class to initialize. Maybe the physics engine later as well, put that inside of the class. And the question is how the customization is going to change. Because here, the way that it customizes is you change a value of the props you pass, I think. So you put you create a use state that is gonna change depending on a button. So like you can imagine you create a component, then you create user state variables, then you set up, or you can access the values of the store, and then based on whether you click, it changes the value, and then when it changes the value, it's gonna change everything else. So I think the store is the main way to create the custom component, and then you make everything else based on that. So I think it does make sense to do the other class actually, because instead of using the React 3 components, I'm gonna be creating the 3JS components. So I think that's the biggest difference. And then for convenience, it's probably better to put the layouts inside of the class as well. And then the only difference is that I would call the methods from the class instead of calling them outside. And then I make the hooks pretty much the same as they are doing here. Interesting. Layouts. Maybe I should do the same thing as well. They are doing here, just use ref. But then I would make based on the class. So this is a method, create the method on the class. And then I pass inside the use callback. But then I use the ref to... Yeah, but then if I use the ref, like this is the issue, because they're updating the ref inside of the function. And if I make this a method on the class, I'm not going to be able to do that. Unless I create a variable inside of the class, then I make it equal to the ref, but it doesn't feel right, I think. The question is, how are they using the layout current to update this component? I should probably use layouts as well. The main difference between use layout effect and use effect is that use layout effect runs first, I think. Maybe there are other differences, but I don't remember. But I know that one of the main differences is this one runs first. So they're calling this function inside of this one. And then they make based on the edges, which makes a lot of sense. And they are gonna base the logic on whether whether or not they're gonna render the nodes and edges based on this variable here. But let me see where they're using this one. Oh, it's passed here as layouts. So they get the current layouts, and then inside of this one, which is the tick. So this is gonna be the callback function inside of the other one. Once it's stable, it's gonna run this one. And when it's not, it's gonna run this other function, which sets the nodes and edges based on the result of the layout. And I guess this function is probably gonna use the graph to calculate the layout based on whatever this one is, which comes from this other one. I gotta be honest, it seems a lot like it seems that it's more complicated than it should be. That's the thing. Like, there must be ways to simplify this. Like, it doesn't feel right to put all of these functions instead of the other ones. It just complicates everything. But the challenge is how do I transform this stuff into the other one while still using the hooks to optimize the rendering on React. I understand how it works, but it's difficult to think about how to change. And there are different ways that I think about. Like, what I'm thinking about now is that I can create a variable inside of the visualization class that is gonna keep track of this. The same way that they're using here, I can just do the use ref as well, and then set up these hooks as well. And then the only difference would be that I initialize a variable inside of the visualization class that would keep track of this one, and then I make the condition on whether or not I'm gonna call the rendering from the class based on the variable from the class as well, which is dependent on the ref, but it doesn't seem like that is the correct thing to do. But I think I can copy this function. The way that use callback works is that it's gonna change, I think. It's gonna cache the function definition. And I think it's just gonna update when one of these values changes, which are the dependencies. So let me think about it. I think for this function I can just copy. Let me see. So they are using the layout current only on this effect here. And size label changes. So the only points of the layout current is to cache the current layout, as far as I understand. So the first time that it runs is gonna grab the layout from this function, which is probably gonna be here. So it builds the graph, then runs the thing, which sets up the layout current, which is just a cache to the layout. Then sets up this function and sets up the nodes. It calls this function, sets up the nodes and edges based on the new layout, which happens on this function probably. And then it sets up the other use effect so that whenever there's a change on the variable, it's gonna run the function again with the cached layout. And then the layout might change depending on the props that it receives from the parent, which is gonna contain the layout type. But it's very complicated. So I have to spend some time thinking about, because I have to transform all of this stuff on the imperative way. It's very complicated to do. There's so many questions. And the feeling that I get is that it doesn't need to be this complicated, I think. I think there are probably ways to simplify on the other way. Let me just search. I'm gonna go back to the steps, because I think if I just think about this stuff, I'm not gonna do anything. I just need to focus on the small steps, and then once I get to the point where I have the visualization, then I just start changing things slightly. I need to figure out how to maybe just ask ChatGPT. It's gonna be easier. No, this is the problem, it just returns the ID. No, I have to use get node. So I think I'm gonna have to do the other way. Just pass the nodes instead. So I pass nodes and edges, and then I make an instance, and then I just loop over the nodes. So, which is not that good. So now the question is whether or not I should call this method from the graph and then modify the object on the graph, or modify the objects on the nodes. So I'm thinking about passing these nodes and edges to this class. And then I initialize them here as well. So these are nodes equals nodes. And then instead of looping over the graph nodes, I loop over these ones. But then the issue with that is that then I would put the objects inside these objects here, so they wouldn't be connected with the graph. That's one way. The other way is to just pass the graph as well to this function, and then I just call the get node from the ID. I guess I can just loop over the graph nodes as well, and then just call the graph get node from the graph itself by passing the ID. That's another way. Yeah, graph get nodes ID. I think I should probably do that. Because I want to change, but it doesn't seem very good. But maybe it doesn't matter that much, because it doesn't make it a lot slower. Oh, this is another problem that I just thought about. That is the camera controls. So I need the renderer. That's the issue. I also need it for the scene, I think. Oh, the scene doesn't need anything. So I need to add the stuff to the scene later, after I initialize the objects here. Yeah, but this is annoying. I forgot about this, that you need the renderer to initialize these classes here. This class. I guess all of these questions is more about like whether or not I should create the class and how to structure the classes in such a way that is gonna work. Like, what is the best way to structure everything? And the main annoying thing is the React cycle. It's very difficult to think about because there are a bunch of nuances and I don't want to spend a bunch of time going over with the debugger again to understand how it's gonna... Because I think I already have a good idea of how it works, but not 100%. And when it comes to the nuances, also not 100% sure. On the... Especially the instances of the classes, I think that's the hardest part. And how everything's gonna work later with the store and the instances, and how the information is gonna change from all of them, and the customization. I think once I figure out the customization, then the rest is separated from this one, doesn't matter that much. So because it's a different part of the process, I think. Parsing the code and getting the information is not it doesn't change anything. It just changes the customization of the stores, of the variables of the store. So, and from that point, I think that's it doesn't matter as long as I set up everything correctly now. So that the visualization changes in the best way possible when the variables of the store changes. But so the question is, should I? Because this is annoying because now it forces me to initialize this inside of here, because I'm initializing the render inside of the use effect, and it has to be that way because I want to initialize the render every time that the component mounts and unmounts. The way that they do it with Reactor Fiber is creating a custom reconciler, and then they create a... Not sure if it's create elements. I think it's create root. So they create a root object based on the scene, I think. Either the scene or the renderer. And then they mount the custom reconciler on that root object, which comes from the scene or the renderer. And then the children has a provider, and it gets very confusing as well, the way that they do it. So, fuck, let me think. Maybe I'll stop here. Already been streaming for a long time. This is the reason, I think the main reason why I'm taking so long to do this stuff. It's not hard to do, it's not hard to code, it's much harder to think about what is the best way to structure things. That's the challenge here. Maybe I should just like do stuff and then think about it later on. But this is a massive problem, because if I do like this, then I can't make this dependent on the store, because it depends on the renderer. So what is the point? So maybe instead of a class I should just have a function to initialize things, and then I build another class for managing. I think that might be the best approach now that I think about it. So I just create a function to initialize everything, and then I call the function like to initialize the controls and the scene, and also to put the objects on the to put the 3GS objects on the graph nodes, and then I make based on the graph nodes themselves. So just call like this and set everything up. Then I separate the class from this stuff, and the class would be more for controlling the layout, and for maybe it's not even necessary to have a class as well. I have to think more about it as well. Maybe it's better to just have functions. Yeah, the annoying part is the events though, because I'm gonna have to set up this raycaster. But I think I can just set up instead of a function. So just put another function, or just add the event listeners inside of this. And maybe for the layouts is also not necessary to have the class, because I can just use the graph directly. I can build it the same way that they are doing here, where I just make an instance of the graph on the store. The one thing that I don't understand really well here is how, I guess that they initialize the graph inside of the store. That's the difference. So they initialize inside of the store, then they access the instance, and then the nodes is the same, I think. And then they just update the data from the store with the inside of the component. I think that's what I'm gonna do actually. And I probably don't need the class. And then I just do the layout the same way that they are doing. The only difference is gonna be that I'm handling the components inside of the graph, the objects inside of the graph, instead of making a component. But it might be, and they are also using React Spring Animated to set the positions. The tricky part is the positions, because I don't understand how the layout works. These functions work really well. What I don't like about this is that it seems seems overly complicated. That's the problem. I think that should be possible to simplify this. Maybe at the end of the day, it's just better to use this library though, because it's a lot easier, and then I can focus on the other stuff that's also gonna be hard to figure out. Now that because now I already understand how everything works. It's more about like details, but I already understand how everything is connected, how the source code works, and I can make it happen with the other approach. It's just a matter of time, I think. How much time I'm gonna spend. So like in case I use this one and then for whatever reason there are bugs, I'm confident that I can change the code so to make it work. Maybe it's better to. The biggest downside is the stuff that I was talking about in the beginning, that this is gonna make it more coupled with React, and like it becomes harder to separate the core stuff that I'm trying to do, because I have to deal with the state from React. So it would be better the imperative, because then I have more access, more control, more flexibility, and more access on the core fundamental thing, which is just transforming the information in visualization. Oh, for each node. So maybe this shows the object. Oh, actually, it's gonna be inside, not map. No, but it doesn't get the object, maybe? There's something wrong. I think just because I changed the place that I'm initializing the graph. That's the problem. I know that already exists. The issue is that it's not is the whole thing about the rendering, because this exists, so like it doesn't create a new class. That's the problem. I'm just gonna do it like this for now, and then I'll just to see if I can loop over the nodes. So maybe I fix I create the functions that are gonna put this stuff on the nodes first, and then I think about this other stuff that is more difficult to figure out. Yeah, this also doesn't give me access to the objects, so I think I have to do it the other way and just get the node based on this, maybe. It doesn't exist. I'm pretty sure I've seen this function here though. It doesn't exist. Maybe these don't nodes. So it does show the objects. Oh, I can loop over the values, so yeah, probably that's what I'm gonna do. Oh, but no. There's an object that has the... So the value is node data, so they created the structure to do everything else, probably. It's more complicated. So I need to think about at what place is better to... I think what I'm gonna do is just loop over the values of this array here, which is gonna be these objects. And then maybe I put inside of this value, this mix data node. I need to figure out what is the best place to make the link between the 3JS objects and the graph. Maybe it's just better to do the same way that they did it, where I think it's simpler that way, where I just update the nodes and the edges directly without... So I make the values on 3JS objects inside of the nodes and edges directly. I think that's probably better. So just do it the same way that they did it. And then for the layout and for the positions, I will access the values from the nodes and edges. But maybe if I add the values, it's gonna fuck up the graph as well. But I think that's what I'm gonna do now. I think I'm gonna stop streaming. I'm gonna figure this out off stream. There's a bunch of questions. So if I can't figure this out by Friday, I'm just gonna use this library, and I'm gonna start focusing on the compiler, interpreter, and the information parts. But I'm gonna try to make it happen with the imperative approach first. So I think that the first thing that I'm gonna do after the stream is just try to connect the graph with, or put the 3JS objects inside of the nodes and edges. Then from that point, I'm going to see if anything renders on the screen by calling the render method, and then I see if the camera controls work and if the 3JS objects are like the same as they are on the other visualization. Then after, I think I'm just gonna try to make it happen like the simplest way possible and not optimal. And then after I make it happen, then I think about these more difficult decisions of how to structure the store, the classes, the functions, and everything else like that, in a way that makes sense. So yeah, I'm not sure when I'm gonna come back, but I'm either gonna continue to try to implement this, depending on how hard it's gonna be to decide this stuff, or I'm gonna start studying interpreters and compilers next, and then just go with the library that I found. So yeah, till next time.